Okay, welcome everybody. This is Josh Haas, past board member and vice chair for the Hawk Migration Association of North America, longtime HMANA supporter, and I'm excited to be here with you all in lieu of Julie, who's on a raptor road trip visiting some of our trusted raptor migration sites in the Northeast and Southeast. So I'm here also joined by Kat Lauer, one of HMANA's staff members. And we're excited to welcome Jim Watson today for a talk about Ferruginous Hawks. So definitely a topic that people have showed a lot of interest in, and we're excited to welcome him today. Before we get too far along, just some administrative housekeeping items. We are on Zoom today. We are not allowing anybody the ability to unmute themselves or share any content. This is webinar style presentation. However, we do invite you to open up your chat window. You can do that at the bottom of Zoom. And please connect with us, engage with us. Tell us where you're dialing in from and maybe where your closest migration site is that you support. But more importantly than just that, keep that chat box open as Jim walks through his presentation. I'm sure it will spark some interest in possible questions. Please use the chat to enter your questions, and Kat will be keeping track of those. So at the end of Jim's presentation today, she will walk through those questions with him and we can get those answered. Additionally, from a Zoom perspective, in the upper right-hand corner of Zoom, you'll see a little box that says View. If you don't like the way things look for you right now, click on the View in the top right, and you can play around to customize the view exactly how you'd like it. With that, we will have some fun things to talk about at the end related to our upcoming 50th anniversary conference in Duluth, Minnesota. So stay tuned for that. If you haven't registered, please get out there and register. We are excited to engage with everybody in person at this conference. But if you find yourself as someone who's not able to be with us in person, we have a virtual option for Saturday of that conference, and that will allow you all of Saturday's content. So keep that in mind. We'll talk more about that at the end. And with that, I'll turn things over to Kat, who will introduce Jim. Go ahead, Kat.
Thank you so much, Josh. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to welcome Jim Watson for our Lunch and Learn today. Jim is a wildlife research scientist with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he's the lead researcher for the statewide raptor study. He has spent the last 50 plus years studying raptors in the Western United States and abroad. Jim's research focuses on raptor population dynamics, migration ecology, and management of raptors in human landscapes. His recent work evaluates the impacts of wind energy and lead contaminants on golden eagles and ferruginous hawks. So we're so excited. Please take it away when you're ready, Jim.
Great. Thank you, Kat, and thank you, Josh. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I just mentioned to Josh and Kat how excited I was to actually talk about one of the species that I've had a love for years, ever since my youth, and actually provide some information for folks that may be less familiar with this species from the eastern part of the United States, if that's where you're coming from. And see a lot of friends, so I'm glad to have you on board as well. Wanted to start, if you see the slide here, you're not at the wrong presentation. We're actually not going to talk about Swainson's hawks in detail, but I did want to start off by talking about three kind of prominent species that nest in the western United States and that exemplify differences in migration. And the first of which is the adult Swainson's hawk migration map is shown here. If you'll notice that star in the upper left-hand corner, that's where I'm located in Western Washington. This is a map of 16 adult birds we radioed and monitored several years ago, but it shows the typical Swainson hawk migration patterns throughout the year, which is what we call hardwired, more of an obligate migration, complete migration, a species that you can count on pretty much when it's going to migrate each year and where it's going to go. So that bird represents kind of an extreme in migration, and maybe a middle of the road bird, red-tailed hawk, Different migrations throughout the range. This is a subset of birds we radioed several years ago, up till monitoring them recently. You can see the stars on the map. Those are the locations where these birds were breeding. And for this species, migration is a little bit different, more of a facultative migrant, less predictable in terms of exact timing and relationships to prey that it is securing and guiding migration. And then you'll notice about half the birds that we monitored in this small subset actually migrated, so a partial migrant compared to the complete migration of Swainson's hawks. Now that introduces us then to the Ferruginous hawk, and you'll notice the title here, a little bit of humor, off the beaten path. We're going to talk about a species that is kind of an oddball in this migration world. So buckle up and let's chat. Now again, if you're from Eastern North America, you may not be as familiar with this species. It's just a little bit of background. The Latin word ferrous is familiar to us, and obviously the connotation of rust and the beautifully orange feathers on this bird, or rust-colored feathers. It's prominently or diagnostically identified by really two or three things. One is the large orange cere and very wide gape. I should say yellow or orange cere. Something that's pretty special in terms of identifying this bird. Secondarily, you'll note the feathered legs down to the toes. And then the light, obviously, in this case, white tail. That's a nice feature. And then there are two recognized morphs, the light morph forms, the two birds on the left in the photo, and then on the right, a dark morph. And, excuse me, within the light morph form, that's an adult female on the left, adult male in the middle. Yeah, some variation that's not generally recognized in the literature, but nonetheless one which, if you've handled enough of these birds, you'll see that the adult females tend to have a heavier colored marking. Adult males tend to be gray and lighter marked. And again, this species in the the species name regalis, you'll see the word regal. Some of the adult females may range up to 1.5 meters in wingspan, and in fact, in the north may range up to 2 kilograms in mass. So pretty good sized bird. One of the key aspects of this species' ecology is they're dietary specialists. And this is a map of a breakdown of Ohlendorf's summary of food habits across range. But in particular, you want to notice that 44% of at least Ohlendorf's summary was sciurids. So this species really likes fossorial mammals, particularly prairie dogs and ground squirrels, comprise a large part of the diet. And then on the lower right, the leporids, rabbits, cottontails, as well as jackrabbits are also quite important throughout the range. And then you'll notice a mix of insects, other small mammals, and birds as well. Now, not surprisingly, the association of those prey items, the fossorial mammals and the jackrabbits, if you go across the range of this species, whether you're in the breeding range of Canada or the United States or wintering range in Mexico, you might just yawn as you look at these photos because everything looks the same, and that's pretty typical. This species is obviously as a tertiary consumer. They're specifically tied to the food found in these habitats more than directly to the habitat itself. But because they're dietary specialists, you're going to find them in these habitats where you find rabbits and squirrels and prairie dogs. Now, if you were to look at the birds of the world map for the species, it looks fairly uninteresting at first glance. You'll notice the breeding range, the species ranges up to Canada, so truly a species that's at international interest. Then down in the middle, you'll see some birds that are not migratory, presumably, and then down at the bottom, the wintering range birds ranging down to Mexico. So this species is a North American species uh, in every sense of the word. But I don't think this map probably tells the full story. But we'll start with a little bit of summary information. If we go back to pre-telemetry days, band returns from this period that were summarized by Gossett in Dan Gossett and his thesis work. Joe Schmutz up in Canada banded a lot of birds, and the picture of recoveries from those birds suggests, a north-south migration along the Rocky Mountain front, and then a few birds passing over the Continental Divide and found in the western states as well. So that was the picture for a lot of years. One other thing that's interesting about this bird and important is that word nomadism. This species, I would probably say, is the original nomadic, at least nomadic claim to fame. And in the 70s and 80s, it was assumed to be highly nomadic based on some regional studies that were done that found small populations of birds would disappear or appear over, a short number of years. So in one area, you would have a depletion of birds and then a growth in another area. And the assumption was, strong assumption, that there was nomadism taking place and the breeding birds were moving among these breeding regions. This was an important topic because, in fact, the species was petitioned for listing by the Fish and Wildlife Service in 1983 and 1991. And one of the reasons that was rejected was because of the presumption of nomadism, that we can't really tell what the population trend is overall because you've got these subpopulations that are exchanging birds. So we're going to look at a couple things in this brief talk we have today and time together. We're going to first characterize Ferruginous hawk migration regionally and also by season based on field data, and look at some of those specific characteristics we mentioned earlier and where ferruginous hawks fall into that spectrum. And then also talk about this question of nomadism, which we were able to address in some of the work we've done. So from 1999 to 2014, we identified, and this is a large project, we'll pull up the contributors later, but this was a project that certainly, even though I headed up, had involved a lot of cooperators. And we identified all these study areas throughout the range of the species. Most of these are breeding areas, except for the Mexican areas in Chihuahua and Nuevo Leon are obviously wintering areas. And in each of those areas, we captured adult birds by a variety of means, but here showing mist nets and using great horned owl lures as capture technique, and also hand grabbed youngsters out of nests for banding young. And we use GPS telemetry in this study, satellite and solar telemetry specifically, to get the long-term information and multiple years of annual migration. And we ended up banding or telemetering 69 adults and 54 juveniles in the work that we did. So let's talk about the results. We had compiled of all the adults 123 individual annual migrations. And so that was our data set that we worked with. First thing that was obvious is this species is a broad front migrant. And so that's a term I think most of you are familiar with, whereas Swainson's hawks and others fly along specific flight lines or corridors, ridges that are pretty traditional. Among individual hawks, these birds are moving from their ranges in a broad front pattern rather than along these flight lines. And many of you I know are hawk watchers and actual migration counters. And I'd venture to guess, Ferruginous hawks probably don't account for one of those columns on your data sheet that you record counts from because there's so few in number at most migration sites. Now, there are a couple exceptions. One would be Dinosaur Ridge in Colorado, which is a spring migration site, interestingly enough, where you do get a fair number of birds passing through that particular location each year. And then there's some fall migration sites that get a large number of birds, relatively speaking, goshoots, bridgers, Commissary Ridge is another. But in general, what you found, and I saw Dave Olyar is on the call. This species doesn't account for 10% of the migration population in a given year, and doesn't therefore, at least according to the RPI standard, qualify for, summarizing in terms of trying to determine trend. And it's just an indication that these birds don't pass in large numbers along these migration sites, but rather it's a broad-fronted migration. We're going to look at a minute. The next factor was the species differs by region and how regionally these birds from these populations migrate. And to give you an idea as to total annual migration distance, you'll see 2,300 kilometers. If you have trouble relating that to a real number, that's about the width of the United States if you look at a map. But you'll notice the standard deviation there is pretty broad. So there's quite a bit of a variation in the annual migration distance by region. So let's get into some nitty gritty as far as movements. Looking at annual movements of the adults from our telemetry work. If you look at Canadian birds throughout the year, pretty much as you might predict along the Rocky Mountain front, north to south, down into the plain states. We throw the Dakota birds on there, generally the same pattern, chain, you might say, a little bit of southward movement beyond our Canadian birds. And you'll notice there is one bird that moved to the north, and we'll talk about those birds in a minute that moved northward in the fall. Now, the Wyoming bird's a little bit different. You'll see a mass of birds that move northward from Wyoming. And you'll also see that quite a number of birds move as far south as Mexico. And then if we put the centralized plains birds on there, you'll see that in fact they don't, at least the birds we monitor, didn't fly into Mexico, but they mill around more. I guess that's a scientific term we can use, mill around more in the central plains states throughout the year. Now, obviously, this is a sample of birds we radioed. I wanted to point out Jesse Watson, who's on the call as well, has done some extensive migration work for his master's thesis work from Canada. And I know in their sample of birds, they actually had a few birds pass over the Continental Divide. As you'll notice here, we had 2 birds, so not a lot of movement over the Continental Divide from these birds that breed east of the Rocky Mountains, which is consistent with what we found. They also had a few birds that went into Mexico. So again, these patterns, obviously from a sample, may be a little bit different as you expand the sample. But I think the takeaway message here, again, is not too much moving over the Continental Divide for these breeders east of the divide, and pretty much a north-south movement, whether it's chain migration or maybe some leapfrog migration involved for particular populations. Now, when you go west of the divide, things get a little more interesting. These birds, we didn't radio any breeding birds I should say any nesting birds at their breeding sites in the Great Basin, but we did radio birds down in Mexico. And you can see where they originate down in Mexico and went to breeding sites throughout the Great Basin. But the important thing here is they remained in the Great Basin. A little bit of movement over the Continental Divide up to Montana and Wyoming, Idaho, up in that area. But in general, more of a north-south migration from this population. And then when we add the Washington, Oregon birds, Pacific Northwest, it gets kind of ugly. These birds do a very interesting migration, starting with the breeding in southern Washington there. You'll see some birds head up to Alberta. Some head southeasterly down into the plain states and actually go to the front range of the Rockies in Colorado and Wyoming. And then ultimately they end up back in California later in the winter, where they winter in the great Central Valley and eventually then fly back home. So much more of a circular migration pattern for those particular hawks. So that in a nutshell is kind of the picture for regional movements of adult ferruginous hawks that we found. There are obviously a lot of questions associated with that. So let's get into those. When you look at these patterns, 3/4 of the birds were moving to 3 distinct seasonal ranges. And those were the fall ranges, winter ranges, and then breeding ranges. And it's important that these weren't just stopover areas in the fall where the birds stopped briefly. They're actually established range locations. And that's pretty unique. That's the important takeaway really from this seasonal information is ferruginous hawks are pretty specialized in that they have a fall migration or a summer migration to these fall ranges. Some of the work they've done on prairie falcons in Idaho has also shown a similar type of fall movement as well. The rest of the birds, the rest of the quarter of the migrations were kind of a mix of different patterns. We'll talk about one of those in a moment. But the key here is this was the majority of birds moving in this type of seasonal pattern. And you'll notice I kind of give a hint as to why, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's related to prey, these movements. Now we'll take a minute to digest this figure. It's a little bit involved. Same color coding as the adult movements you can see on the left, but I've added a seasonal component to it. And down on the bottom, you'll see the key breeding areas, circle, triangle, and square for winter. And the idea of if we just use an example, if we go to the top of the map, we'll see a red circle, which is indicative of Canadian breeding locations. And everything within that light colored polygon would encompass all of our telemetry locations for a particular component. In this case, you had Canadian breeding within that area, but you'll also notice a red triangle. So you had winter or Canadian birds that summered in that area as well. And then if you go down to the plains, you'll notice a red triangle and a red square and the various polygons. And then down in the big polygon to the south, the big red square. So indicative of the Canadian birds using fall ranges in the South Dakotas and or the Dakotas, as well as Wyoming, and then some birds wintering down southward. Now, the whole idea of this map in breaking this apart is look at metapopulation use. What are the areas that are important to the metapopulation? In other words, what areas are used by more than one of these regional populations? And I've highlighted the two important ones, at least for our talk here. And the first is northern grasslands in late summer. You'll notice there's a variety of birds that use fall ranges in the northern grasslands in late summer. And as you move down into the plains, you'll see quite a few different populations use those areas in the fall. And then as you get to the big polygon in the front of the Rockies, you'll see lots of color and lots of big red and green and blue squares, indicative of that's where a lot of ferruginous hawks from multiple populations winter. Again, an important area is meant to identify that location as an important area. And just a couple other points to make. You'll notice the two Mexican locations of down in Mexico. We've got birds that winter down that way. In this case, the birds from Arizona, Nevada, and Wyoming wintering there. And another interesting point to make here is the location in the Central Valley of California. Notice the majority, if not all the birds we had in our study were wintering birds that eventually return to the Pacific Northwest to breed, reflecting that circular kind of pattern we discussed earlier. So the question is, what is the association here? Well, I've already kind of broken the news on that. The fact that this facultative migration is prey driven for these birds, very heavily related to prey. And specifically, you'll notice the Richardson ground squirrel slide to the north. Now, there are ground squirrels throughout this species range, but Richardson's ground squirrels at the location there are the latest species to estivate. So they go underground in late summer or into fall, whereas some of the other populations to the south would already be estivating. So the point is, these squirrels are still above ground and therefore providing food for a lot of different populations, breeding populations of Ferruginous hawks. So you can see that's an important area. And as you move down to the Great Plains, obviously jackrabbits can become important in certain periods of time in certain places throughout the Great Plains. But the staple is really black-tailed jackrabbits, or excuse me, our black-tailed prairie dogs. Now, black-tailed prairie dogs, if you're not too familiar with the species, they actually enter a torpor, not a real estivation, not hibernation, certainly. But there are species, even in, some of these heavily snow-covered areas, they'll be out in the middle of winter as soon as the sun comes out and a little bit of snow melts. So they come above ground and therefore are available as prey. So they can become quite important throughout that plains area. And then if you skip down to Mexico, those are actually areas that are Mexican prairie dog locations and endangered species down in Mexico that are different species. So again, prairie dog's important. And then at the left, you'll notice the California ground squirrel, another species that doesn't hibernate and is often above ground throughout the year, so available for hawks to feed on. Now, to kind of highlight, this is kind of neat just to get some real-time information into this project, to highlight the importance of prairie dogs particularly. This is a fairly interesting and recent study. We've got we're still radioing a few young Ferruginous hawks in some of the work we're doing in Washington. This is a bird we radioed this past summer in July. This is the migration path of the bird through Alberta, down through Montana, through Dakotas, Nebraska. Birdsit did something interesting a couple weeks ago. He flew down near Perryton, Texas, and then you could tell by the location, it's like an, I need to eat something. Widely spaced locations. The bird wasn't becoming localized at all. And he actually flew back north into the sandhills of Nebraska. And then I started looking at the locations, and you start seeing these clustered locations in Colorado. And then as you go on through Kansas, these little clustered locations. Well, pulling up Google Earth down on the lower left, general view of the landscape is you can see the heavily developed agriculture throughout this area. It's obviously throughout that area. If you've been there, you understand that. But again, I was looking at these clusters like the one I have highlighted there. And if you go over to the right, just to illustrate, if you look, and if you've ever been to Colorado or Nebraska, you know what we're looking at here. We're looking at a prairie dog town, and these are prairie dog mounds. You can actually see some of the dark holes, burrows in these mounds if you look closely. So this is pretty cool. This just illustrates a couple things. Number one, the tie to prairie dogs, but more importantly, the importance of these remnant prairie dog towns throughout the plain states. And you can see in this photo that's kind of illustrating some of this winter work. Some of these Ferruginous hawks become pretty social at these prairie dog towns, much like bald eagles, in competing and more importantly, flight following birds to where these prairie dog towns are located, which is what I suspect this young hawk is doing. He's not just, searching haphazardly across the agriculture for prairie dog towns, but he's actually following adult hawks. So anyway, an important aspect of their ecology. Now, the second thing I wanted to talk about in the few minutes we have left is related to nomadism. This was a very interesting aspect of our study, that we found that there was not a complete migration. but a partial migration of this species. And in fact, 2% of the birds didn't migrate at all that were from Wyoming in 2006 to 2008 when there was an explosion of jackrabbits. If you haven't experienced that, it's very interesting. The golden eagle nests that pop up out of nowhere, Ferruginous Hawk nests pop up out of nowhere. But the fact is, when we had that abundance, there were hawks we were monitoring that had previously migrated prior to 2006, but in these years they stopped migrating. Not only that, they were started reproducing, and their offspring weren't migrating as well. The young we radioed from their offspring were non-migratory as well. And as you might expect, reproduction went crazy. Now, this is not a picture from, this is a borrowed picture from a study in Canada. But if you know much about ferruginous hawks, they're more of an R-selected type of reproducer. That is, great prey years, they'll knock out a bunch of young, and in poor prey years, they do much more poorly. But anyway, in this instance in Wyoming, produced a lot of young, birds didn't migrate, and that accounted for an explosion in the ferruginous hawk population over just a few number of years. And remember, think back to what we were talking about with nomadism. This wasn't a result of birds moving anywhere, but simply the prey cycle and its effect on the population. And we also, in the study of nomadism, actually looked at the data empirically, and we computed a repeatability index. So not to get into too much of the minutia, the details, but we ran an ANOVA and looked at the difference in within individual variation in the distance between ranges as compared to between individual variation in successive years. And I'm just illustrating that with these silly red and yellow boxes and blue boxes. Those are, say, one hawk breeding ranges over 5 seasons. The spacing is illustrating the distance between locations, range locations. The yellow, you can see more widely spaced in the breeding in the summer season or the fall period. And then down at the bottom, the winter season and winter range spacing. And the idea here is if you find high correlations among the seasonal ranges in different years, it would be suggested that the birds aren't moving. There's not nomadism. And so look at the results down at the bottom, the 3 range types, breeding, fall, and winter. You'll see that all were significant in terms of correlations, but strong high correlation for breeding ranges with a mean separation of 8 kilometers. That's pretty suggestive that these birds are returning home and coming back to the same place as a rule. Ditto for winter locations. You notice the winter ranges are of 0.73. Separation is wider, about 40 kilometers. But the key is notice the fall ranges. Yeah, they're significant, but low correlation and wide separation, suggestive that if there is any nomadism in the birds we found, it was during that fall, that late summer fall period when the birds were actually moving around to different places. And that was also illustrated in our juvenile movement study. I just want to have one slide on our juvenile movements to highlight what we found. As expected, our juvenile ferruginous hawks had pretty low survival. 1 out of 3 birds survived through migration. They migrated independently from the adults and generally the same regional patterns of movements that we found. But the one thing that was really interesting about juveniles was they're highly itinerant. And I illustrate that with the 2 birds down below. 71% of these birds were moving extensively during that late summer fall period. And if you look 105 kilometers per day for the bird on the left, 98 kilometers per day for the bird on the right. These birds were moving continually in that late summer period. Now, the obvious explanation is probably these are exploratory movements for future reference. So they're creating their map for these future fall migrations, which we just said in our look was a period of nomadism. So kind of an interesting aspect of their ecology here. So let's start to wrap this up quickly. A species is a facultative, partial migrants, prey specialists, prey driven largely by prey, But the key here, and I love having migration folks on this call, is the critical nature of this winter period. These birds are spending across their range 64% of the year away from their breeding ranges. So as we know, most folks emphasize protection of breeding habitats, breeding ranges, which is obviously important, but these birds are spending most of their year away from breeding ranges. Illustrate the importance of that real quickly in a simple diagram. If you look at the condition of birds on the left side of this graph as being a measurement of bird health, and then the seasons across the bottom of the map, you'll notice that in this hypothetical picture, the lowest body weight or condition of the bird is just post-nesting. So that's when the birds lose a lot of weight. And that next step in the fall and winter is when they're regaining their mass and preparing for the next breeding season. And so that's the period that we're looking at with these Ferruginous hawks spending 64% of the year away from the ranges. And notice the consequences of being underweight. You may not return home at all. You may not survive. You may not attain the threshold necessary for breeding. So kind of a hypothetical look at the importance of this period that Ferruginous hawks need. And then finally, it's pretty obvious from the movements of these birds range wide and the time that they're gone that there are all sorts of things taking place on these ranges that may impact winter survival and return to breeding ranges. Several here that are intuitive, and you could give some specific examples. I will mention climate change real quickly is with this species, it's a moderately been identified moderately by the Audubon work as having being affected by climate change. The main impacts are range shifts, breeding range shifts from the south to the north as it becomes hotter. Harder on these fossorial mammals, you'll get a shift in birds nesting on their local populations to the north, and also a chronological shift because the fossorial mammals will go underground sooner to the south. And in the north, when the birds return home, they'll be coming up above ground sooner. You're going to have probably a shift in nesting chronologies at some point. And then all of this is just to point out the species is listed in Canada. Keystone area is Alberta. Been doing a lot of monitoring there. Not me personally, but the Canadians have for a lot of years. That's a critical area. A lot of areas in the United States, the species we just listed in Washington is endangered here because of the decline in breeding populations, and Mexico, a species of concern. But again, my emphasis is on this winter period. Yeah, we have concerns with our breeding populations and prey and issues there, but collectively, what's taking place across the range of this species is quite important. So with that, I'm going to thank the contributors to the project. The first 4 or 5 or 6, I should say, are absolutely 7 or 8. I could keep going, are absolutely critical to this study, and a lot of cooperators. So take note of those. And with that, I haven't monitored the questions to see what Kat's receiving, but I'll leave this slide up, and you can, if you want to research some of this a little bit more deeply, you can look at some of the papers we published, and I also give my email there so you can contact me. So with that, Kat, I'll turn it back over to you, and we can address any questions.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was so
Sure.
informative. We have a few comments first from people out in Colorado and Iowa. So Natalie says from Dinosaur Ridge that they have 23 Ferruginous hawks have come through their Hawkwatch site this year.
Cool.
And Mark has reports that there's a rare but annual at Hitchcock Nature Center in Western Iowa, and they have about 2 to 4 per year. So
Oh, very neat. Very neat. Yeah.
and we have, and I apologize to anybody whose name I do not pronounce correctly, but a question from Ajit Anthony. They are a volunteer at Dinosaur Ridge Hawkwatch, and they get Ferruginous hawks in the spring. So they got 63 in 2022, 65 in 2023, and 23 in 2024. And at Commissary Ridge, which is in Wyoming, they got quite considerably smaller numbers, so 4, 12, and 1 over the last 3 years. And this is similar in the Manzano Mountains in New Mexico. They want to know, why is that? Why does Dinosaur Ridge have so many more? Any ideas on that?
Yeah, and I think what we're saying is the spring migration at Dinosaur Ridge exploded as compared to fall migration when this species, again, a broad-fronted migrant. Well, if we notice what we just talked about in terms of the seasonality of bird use, it's during the return to breeding range that this species is actually going to be fairly focal in where it's going in terms of specific locations, and the birds are returning obviously to nest. So I would suggest there's a definite difference in both migration patterns and the ecology of what's taking place in the spring migration for this species as opposed to the fall migration. So the drive in the spring that birds you're seeing is to go back to nesting areas, and that front the Rocky Mountains is probably a pretty good funnel for a lot of birds to going to Canada and other places. So as opposed to these fall areas where the birds are kind of filtering through, potentially looking for different prey locations. So that would be a quick and dirty off the top of my head explanation.
That's great. Thank you for the insight. Peter Martin would like to know, what is the interaction between these and the ubiquitous red-tailed hawks?
Great question. If we're talking specifically on breeding ranges, the relationship is very much spotted owl, barred owl. If you're familiar with those two species in the Pacific Northwest, you have an ubiquitous species that's a generalist feeder, dietary non-specialist. They eat everything. They can nest in a lot of places. They're very adaptive to human activities, as opposed to spotted owls, i.e. Ferruginous hawks, that are very sensitive to human activity, dietary specialists. And so overall, the relationship and the more aggressive red tails is to Ferruginous hawks is very similar to the displacement of barred owls or the displacement of spotted owls by barred owls, a more dominant species, more generally adapted, and more aggressive. And that has resulted certainly in a lot of places of Ferruginous hawks being usurped by red tails as far as nesting populations.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Mary Normandia, and this one is about how often Ferruginous hawks have to eat. They say that prairie dogs are big, and do they cache the remains?
No, they are not prey cachers to my knowledge. I don't think I've seen that in the literature, have not witnessed that. The thing is that one individual Ferruginous hawk probably is not going to be able to eat a whole prairie dog by virtue of the fact what we saw in the slides. These species, this is a group effort. A lot of times these birds will hunt the prairie dog town by watching other Ferruginous hawks, and they only get their little bit of prairie dog feed for the time that they can defend that prairie dog carcass. So they're going to be out there pretty much every day, unless they're really at an isolated prairie dog town and they get a whole carcass. It might last them 3 days before they start hunting again, but that would be an exception, I would think.
Wow, that's incredible. Mark would like to know that would like to state that they always thought that birds they saw annually at Hitchcock in Iowa in the fall were from northeastern South Dakota and western Minnesota. Your work seems to indicate that they may have been wrong about that. Do you think that these birds are likely nomads instead?
Unlikely. I think that's still a pretty fair guess. Now, I don't know the history of nesting, but obviously there's been a contraction of range over time with this species from some of those eastern areas, even if you had some extraneous nesters over in Minnesota, for example. My best guess is we're still looking at birds moving down from Canada in the far fringes of the the breeding distribution in Saskatchewan, for example, where the species has also declined breeding populations. And my best guess is, again, even we didn't radio birds that far east, but the birds you're seeing there in Iowa would presumably just be those birds moving north to south, but in a more easterly origin in the breeding population. So,
Great. And then Robert Spall would like to know, given your recent advances in our understanding of shooting and direct persecution of raptors, specifically on utility poles for birds that were historically thought to be electrocutions, do you think this highly nomadic species is more subject to shooting than other species of raptors?
great question, and a topic that we could discuss at length. What makes this species vulnerable? Two things. It provides a great target because it's a ground perching bird. So a lot of those birds we have found that we've radioed on wintering areas, for example, have been shot on the ground. Unfortunately, if you know folks that target practice or innocently or not so innocently, that does provide a target. And the other issue is these birds nest in generally huge nests that are quite visible in a lot of places that provide a good target for adults on, you know, on nests and in incubation particularly. The one thing I will mention is I know there's certain places where this bird is unjustly persecuted, and Oregon, Washington is an example. There are traditional places where folks shoot game birds in the fall, or excuse me, shoot game hunting raptors in the fall is a tradition, red-tailed hawks, even falcons, and oftentimes we'll shoot this species in the idea of protecting pheasant, for example, or other game birds, which are not a key prey item of Ferruginous hawks, unfortunately. So to answer your question, I don't think the shooting of this species is it's more localized, but it's still a problem in some areas for sure.
Wow, that's very disheartening.
Yeah.
What sort of sorry, Madison would like to know what sort of work is being done now on population monitoring, given these different population ranges, especially in relation to human disturbance like agriculture and energy.
Great question. It's hit and miss because population monitoring for this species, like many, is largely a state effort, a state-driven effort. It varies across the West, and the interest in non-game wildlife and raptors in particular has a big influence on the importance of whether the species is monitored statewide in, you know, some of the Oklahoma, Texas, etc., Kansas, as opposed to other places. So. My emphasis in this talk and other places is to hope to reevaluate the status of the species, but that's going to require exactly what you're looking at, the state monitoring efforts that provide solid information on breeding population status. And I'm not a big fan of breeding bird surveys for this species and assessing population. And even the breeding bird survey itself said this is not a great species for using that information. So you've hit on a key point. We need to encourage states and much as Canada has done very well, monitoring the status of this species in the next few years.
Great. And that ties into another question from Robert Spall, where he says, if ferruginous hawks were reconsidered under the Endangered Species Act, do you think it would be more possible today to designate these important fall ranges as critical habitat in a reliably predictable manner?
I hope so. And that's the great point, and maybe the take home from what I hope to put together in this study and present it here. That would be the hope. And that would, I think it would be a big step over the last Fish and Wildlife Service review in 1991. I think we've gained a great deal of information on the, you know, the international need to protect this species across borders and throughout the West. So yeah, thumbs up.
Yeah. Sounds good. We have one other question from Yvonne. They want to know, to your knowledge, are there any depredation permits for this species?
The only one I'm familiar with, and Jesse Watson's on the call, has been not a depredation, but aircraft conflict. I know the Salt Lake City Airport, as one example, used to give authorization for collection of this species with aircraft interference, but I'm not aware that this species, in terms of depredation permits, it's a species that doesn't eat anything that's of interest to anybody other than, most ranchers don't like prairie dogs and don't like ground squirrels and probably not jackrabbits. So the species actually eats prey that is can be an issue with agriculture. So anyway,
Yeah, it sounds like we need to get the word out that these birds are super helpful actually to us.
right.
Well, that was so wonderful. Thank you so much for the talk. I think that's all the questions so far. So going to hand it back to Josh, who's going to talk more about the conference.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And just to echo what Kat said as well, thank you so much, Jim. Very well received. A great talk on a species that I don't believe we featured on Lunch and Learn before. So that's a pretty exciting thing for us, especially Julie and I, who have been working through Lunch and Learns for a couple of years now. So thank you again. Yeah, so we're very, very excited to be kind of in the 11th hour, if you will, leading up to our most important 50th anniversary celebration in Duluth. We're just thrilled to be partnering with the Hawk Ridge Bird Observatory, Janelle and all of her team. So HMANA is welcoming a lot of amazing speakers and some great topics for this conference. You've heard and probably seen a lot of our marketing as we've started to lead up to this year. We couldn't be more excited for this celebration because we've done so much in the last 50 years in partnership with our raptor monitoring partners across North and South America. But we're also very excited to see what's to come over the next 50 years. And that is really the goal of this conference, is to first celebrate what we've done over the 50 years that we've been in existence, but then also to look forward at what the next 50 years will bring. Speaking of, just want to call out the ability to register. We still have lots of open spots and field trips, owl banding. All of our programs are covered under your general registration fee. We have a pretty amazing keynote planned, and that includes a banquet dinner as part of that. And, I say all these things, but you might find yourself as someone who's not able to join us in person. And if that's the case, you don't need to worry, because we're offering Saturday, which is our featured day looking ahead to the next 50 years. The entire day of programming will be featured in our virtual option. So we are going to offer all programs on Saturday virtually. And if you go to our HMANA.org website and go to the conference page, all you have to do is simply go to the register here link. And once you go to register, you'll have options for registering both in person and virtually. So please be willing to do that. Partner with us, engage with us, whether it's in person or virtually. And we would thank you greatly for that. Again, thank you, Jim Watson, for a great presentation on Ferruginous today. That was really well received and great. For everybody's awareness, next month, because of our conference, we will be taking a break from Lunch and Learn. So we will have a lot more virtual content to offer in our conference. That's November 7th through 10th. So please look into that. Otherwise, we will look ahead to either December or January for our next Lunch and Learn. Stay tuned, and we will be in touch. Thank you, everybody out here, and we look forward to engaging with you next time. Take care.